try to do now is to introduce Ole Bouman a little bit and connect him to the engagement mediating tactics. Currently, Ole Bouman is the director of Design Society in Shenzhen, in China. Before, he was the director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute in Rotterdam, and before that, editor-in-chief of the Dutch architecture magazine Archis. Ole Bouman, in my opinion, is someone with a mission, someone with a strong dedication towards and concern for architecture. He has outspoken opinions about it and a strong belief in architecture's formative and transformative capacities for society. As a discipline and a practice that imagines, organizes, and shapes spaces and places, it ought to fully activate and direct its capacities towards a rethinking of itself, and also, I quote Ole, towards establishing the measures and the balance that allow us to remain human. Sorry for the interruption. Or the stumbling. After the postponement of the Venice Biennale at the beginning of March, he wrote a passionate and urgent call to action to architects and artists alike. He invites them to reflect on the pervasive new spatial conditions in which we live due to a virus gone loose, and to conceive of what he calls a new spatial contract. The sense of urgency pervades throughout the text. It must be done right now rather than later. Ole Bouman's concerns and agenda can be associated with some of the aims that the Master Engagement Mediating Tactics has set for itself, which is to become an environment in which architecture's potent complexities and fields of tensions can be engaged, mediated, rethought, and remade. The aim to deploy strategies to improve architecture's capacities for shaping the futures of the worlds we inhabit. In Ole's words that I took or maybe stole from his website, exploring new frontiers of doing architecture, creating value by identifying issues that matter and unleashing the imaginative powers of design to deal with them. Thank you, Ole, for your valuable contribution to this endeavor. And now for me, it's time to give the words and the stage to you. Good luck.
Thank you, Thierry. And thank you, Lilette, for this introduction and a wonderful opportunity to share some visions about the current situation architecture finds itself in, especially on the platform of the Catholic University of Leuven. And before I start, I thought what you did, Lilette, to check out on the audience by asking to identify themselves in terms of where they're from and what they are interested in. Maybe I can add one more question, which is how many in the audience has a Catholic inclination, since we are on this Catholic platform. Could be a background, could be an interest, could be an animosity, but I'm just wondering how much Catholicism can be inside the discourse of this evening. I cannot see the waving hands. Lilette, can you report?
You cannot see them. There are 13 out of, by now we are with 80 people.
Okay.
So 1-3.
Okay, well, maybe that's the percentage on the level of world population of Catholics. So I think that is let's say a justified representation. I do think it is an interesting factor because not only due to my respect for such an venerable institution as the Catholic University of Leuven, as a European, it's always great to be invited by such an institution. But I also think that the topic of tonight may have may have, it's speculative, but may have elements of a spiritual drive behind new endeavors in architecture, to which I will turn at the end of my speech and dedicate some words to. But before we get there, let me share my screen and open the PowerPoint and start the lecture. So the topic of tonight is designing distance. And obviously, there has been a lot of talking in recent days and weeks, and for some on the globe in months, about not only distance as a factual observation of how we organize our life and spaces, but as a very urgent issue that is related to our strong need to battle a pervasive contagion of the COVID-19 virus. So distance these days is something that is beyond positive. It is actually almost an existential issue. So what the title represents is how design, and in particular architectural design, can contribute to the way we deal with distance, create distance, overcome distance, divert distance, reinterpret distance, and maybe help our ability to accept the establishment of distance as something that is a challenge and is actually something that can inspire. But before we get there, we need to investigate first the predicament of distancing itself. And the reason I'm so interested in this topic goes back for many years. This is the title page of the first publication that I did many years ago, together with my colleague Roemer van Toorn, where we try to connect architecture as a culture focused and sometimes even obsessed with beauty and with the special, and architectuur autre in French, as something that has to do with the aesthetical dimension of building and all the conditions that actually are influencing this very self-image of architecture. An incredible, strong and decisive context that determines architecture practice at the end of the day, but which is very often and sometimes even completely ignored or refuted in architectural discourse itself. So an effort to re-establish the strong connection between architecture as an art and architecture as an answer to social needs. And there was one particular contributor to this book. We did an interview with him, and that was Giancarlo De Carlo, the late Giancarlo De Carlo, who did the opening lecture in the series of interviews in this book. And one of his most famous quotes is, "Architecture is too important to leave to the architect." And although he was an architect himself, very much so, very respected and completely honored and acknowledged contributor to the main architectural discourses between the 40s and maybe the 80s. He was one architect who, whatever recognition and respect he received, he always thought that architecture is something as a servant to higher goals and causes. And not only that, which is in a way also a cliche to state, he also thought that architects sometimes are even detrimental to the direct observation of the needs of society to be answered by spatial solutions and, as a matter of fact, by architectural solutions. So he always tried his entire career to present architecture as something more than what architects normally come up with. And since the large majority of the audience tonight is from architecture, I hope I don't insult you with this. I do know that it is sometimes insulting because it's not the first time I mentioned this legacy from Giancarlo De Carlo. But I do think that especially in the urgent situation that we find ourselves in today, it's very good to look beyond the boundaries of our own specialized discourse and to see what inspiration we can get from others. As a kind of second source for the presentation I'm giving you today, I mentioned this publication, which came out in 2007, a special issue of the magazine Volume, which succeeded Arcus, which Thierry already mentioned as one of my previous jobs. Volume came with an issue dedicated to an alternative practice of architecture called Unsolicited Architecture, which for lots of architects was almost like a contradiction in terminus, because architecture by definition was supposed to be solicited. You need to have a client, you need to have a location, you need to have a budget, and you need to have a program. And only then, when all these conditions are met, you can come up with an architectural solution. And this issue of Volume tried to investigate what happened if one of, or even more, of these cornerstones of architecture were actually out of the question, out of the equation. For instance, so what happened? What can you do as an architect if there's no client? If there's nobody calling you to come up with a design? Or what can you do if there's no site, specific site, and still you're trying to be relevant as a designer, and so on and so on. So as a second example of a certain attitude to look further than the architecture as the end result of the building practice, I think this is an important reference as well. And here is the basic diagram that expresses the way we came up with a methodology to practice unsolicited architecture. And here is an example of a pop-up, a little pop-up pavilion that nobody was asking for, but just by the initiative of some people at some point in time, at some point in space in the city of Rotterdam, it happened as an unsolicited act of architecture. And then the third reference is, that has already been mentioned by Thierry, an article that I wrote very recently when the organization of the Venice Biennale decided to postpone the opening of the Biennale until August 29 this year, trying to figure out whether such a respectable institution as the Venice Biennale could not do something more, let's say, engaging and more immediate and more urgent once it had to face the reality of a pandemic. Could there be something more creative than just postponement? So against the backdrop of Venice emptying itself out of any of its hordes of tourists, there was this question, what would happen if the Biennale, with its very interesting question by the current curator, Hashim Sarkis, which is how will we live together? That's the theme of the upcoming Biennale. How is this theme and with the position, the institutional position of the Biennale in global architecture, what would happen if this institution with this theme would immediately jump on the urgent questions that we're facing today. This is to say a little bit about my way of thinking and trying to expand the boundaries of architecture beyond the act of building and beyond the institutional discourse of architects themselves. And then back to the word distance. I think it's not so complicated etymology for distance. And basically, it means 2,000 years ago what it means today. Disto, I stand apart. Distare, not standing here, but standing actually elsewhere. It immediately implies a certain separation. So distance is something that has to do with a self-awareness that you are not at the place you are supposed to be, or you should be, or you're expected to be. There is a certain delay or a certain distance, so to speak, that problematizes the immediacy of the moment. And I think it's, as a term already in itself, interesting to consider and to think about the cultural implications and background of this word. So now there is this rapidly rising awareness that we need to create distance, we need to observe and respect distance, and maybe we can also design distance. And there the role of architecture comes in play. And when there is such a need to consider the need for distance, architecture has a chance to reclaim some of its relevance, because since times immemorial, you could say, architecture has addressed this question of creating distance, organizing distance, observing distance, enhancing distance, beautifying distance. Architecture in itself as a practice, what else is it doing than playing with distance? So there is, theoretically speaking, conceptually speaking already, a role to play for architecture. But of course, it only makes sense when we get closer to the issue by examining practices in past and present. And what I will do in the remainder of the presentation is just touch upon a range of these practices and see how architecture before and today can capture the energies of the current situation and be inspired by it and come up with new proposals. So this is, in a way, an interesting example of architecture not responding directly to a pandemic, although there are traces of it. But it's the work of Henri Sauvage in the Rue Vavin in Paris, which was conceived in the 1920s when there was a very fresh memory of the previous pandemic of the Spanish flu in 1918-19, when architecture as a discipline became extremely interested in ways architecture could contribute to a more pure, clean, and hygienic world. And already in the way the terracing of the apartment dwellings in the Rue Vavin, but also the choice of tiles and ceramics in the cladding, very easy to clean and easy to maintain, were inspirations of an architect not only to do the basic necessity and make and let's say provide a easy maintenance of the building, but also to translate this need into an aesthetic that gives an entire new look to the street facade of the Rue Vavin. And another example is the Vanille factory in Rotterdam that already in its outlook, but certainly if you know more about all the reasons behind, there was an incredible interest in health and the health of the workers, but also the expression of a healthy lifestyle in the stylistic choices of the architect. And even a level deeper in the work of Jonas Duiker, there is this example of an open air school in Amsterdam in a similar vein of optimism, believing in architecture as a contributor to a healthier, more pure, and more resilient world, building new generations to become more resilient and stronger in life. And these historical examples, here another one, die Wohnung für das Existenzminimum, another example of architecture addressing its potential role to be very vital as a profession. And I mention deliberately the word vital profession because that's the current discourse as well, when we are now going through this awful pandemic. And we see in many countries that that they made a distinction between essential, let's say vital professions, essential services, and the rest. And suddenly there is a let's say a redeemed recognition for many professions that for a long time seem to be on the wane or very low in the public respect rankings, so to speak. But architecture these days didn't make it into a vital profession. It's not seen as a profession that plays a crucial role in maintaining public life. It's not seen as something that is that needs, let's say, an exemption to be allowed to do things that others are no longer be allowed to in a lockdown situation, and so on. So I think it's also interesting to consider how architecture, with this legacy and with this history, can, in the current situation, fight back and become more a vital service, so to speak. And talking about distance, I give you a few other clues that actually this need to create distance and to organize distance is something that is already on the agenda for quite some time. There are already typologies in architecture that refer to distancing in a very explicit way. Almost anybody is now relying on geolocation-based navigation devices, helping you to navigate not by an immediate relationship with the world around you, but with the software translation of the space around you that guides you to the right address, and you not remembering exactly how you came there. Here another example. So actually abstraction of distances from something that you feel and see and perceive and use your senses for to something that is a protocol that brings you from A to B in the most efficient way. And also even previously with the whole discussion about air pollution, now there is of course a lot of talking about the need or not for masks to protect yourself against the virus. But actually there has been moments before that people in the West, to a slight extent, but certainly in the East, in China, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, were protecting themselves with masks just for reason of air quality, bad air quality. And as you can see, distancing from the other around you is a very normal condition these days when people are completely immersed in their smartphone world and have very little attention of the world around them. So you could say that there are tendencies already abound that bring us to a certain acceptance to distancing that might have been much more difficult 20 years ago when these devices were not there yet. And I give you another example of previous trends towards distancing. an example that I have been responsible for myself as director of the National Architecture Institute in the Netherlands, when we developed an app that would help you to roam the streets of the Netherlands, the Dutch cities, and investigate the architecture and the urbanism there with the help of an app that brought you in immediate contact with the vast archives of the National Institute, helped you with understanding why certain buildings were there, helped you with investigating what other buildings, previous buildings, had been there, etc. So there was the possibility to go beyond the walls of a museum, helping you to rely on the vast knowledge base of that institution, considering on the spot how things used to be, how things could be, or how things will be by incorporating in the software all kinds of future projects that could already be seen on the skyline through the lens of your camera, even when the object was not yet built. So here another example of previous trends to distancing. This is already a quite old example of from the 90s, where you see how in Second Life, but also the software program of Second Life, the game, but also in the early traces of smart urbanism developments, you saw how administrations, architects, engineers, and installation experts were collaborating to establish a just-in-time logistics where cities became more and more rather than only a physical artifact or a social condenser, actually a logistical system where time protocols could help people to make life much more efficient. So avoiding hassle, avoiding obstacles, avoiding delays, and knowing exactly the shortest route, the most efficient moment of the day, etc., etc. So this is already a trend also happening for many, many years in East and West. And here some devices that were helpful to proceed with this trend. So domotics, another early example of a trend in architecture to deny or at least refute certain obstacles or let's say reality checks in daily life, where you had to face and actually obey and even submit to the physical realities of the world around you, and how domotics, to make houses more smart, tried to overcome all these ageless, timeless hurdles in experiences the world around us, and making everything smooth, efficient, and convenient. So now in the current situation, of course, the trends that already around us for many years are becoming very topical once again, and maybe even elevated, and people speed them up to face the current situation, where you see the pervasive, the ubiquity of a virus tackling actually all the processes of society, and becoming a looming danger for almost the entire population. Here an early picture of the situation in the Netherlands, early March, and now today you can see the same map completely covered in almost red and dark red. So this same situation that is bringing society to a standstill, so to speak, and especially the economy in a very fragile situation, is also affecting the discipline of architecture tremendously. It's not yet so visible as, for instance, 1 year after the credit crisis disaster 10 years ago. People may still believe that that this is more, let's say, more temporary, and that the situation could get better soon. But there are also clearly indicators that the building practice and the project portfolios of most architects and design offices will get a major blow by the current situation. So that in itself is also a window, so to speak, to consider alternative routes for the discipline of architecture, just as it was 10 years ago when after the first shock of the economic standstill, architects became more and more agile in inventing new practices, defining their core agendas, specializing in architecture that had the best chances on the market, and so on and so on. And currently, we could expect architecture also to go through such a phase, determining what is the most viable and actually also most inspiring to become and remain and become once again very relevant for society. So here is this diagram that you may have seen. It has been circulating on social media quite a bit. Of course, the question for architecture and any other profession is to see what can it do in the yellow zone, the action zone, and become part of an alternative society that overcomes the current blockades and actually in the long run also contributes to addressing the major issues that we know so well, but we did little action so far to address them, which in particular is the climate crisis. Back to the short term and back to the immediate opportunities for architecture to play a role. This is a quotation I took from a scientific article about social distancing. I read it for you. Our findings of the scientists agree with observational and modeling studies that find that early implementation of strong social distancing is essential for controlling the spread of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and that in the absence of the development of new therapies and preventive measures, such as aggressive case finding and quarantining, intermittent distancing measures may be the only way to avoid overwhelming critical care capacity while building population immunity. And that continues. One-time social distancing efforts will push the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic peak into the autumn, potentially exacerbating the load on critical care resources if there is increased wintertime transmissibility. Intermittent social distancing can maintain critical care demand within the current thresholds, but widespread surveillance will be required to time the distancing measures correctly and avoid overshooting critical care capacity. So actually what it says is that among scientific circles, social distancing is not just a political decision to let's say, to mitigate the curve, as they say. The project modeling that from the National Institute of Security and Health, the RIVM in the Netherlands. So it's not only about managing the curve of the disease, but actually it's also an immediate response to the insight that without the social distancing measures, the situation would become extremely serious and actually disastrous to society. So what I'm trying to say is that social distancing and the design of social distancing is not just something that is nice to do, as something that is inspiring or important to consider, but actually it is an essential need in the short term to keep the machine of society going. And that's why, for reasons of this crucial importance of observing distance, we see in certain situations law enforcement to this degree, where the public arena is no longer something that needs safety, so to speak, but actually is something that needs to be monitored and and supervised by even the army to make sure that the epidemic remains under control. So then I give you a few more examples of how this law enforcement and this insight in the need of social distancing is translated in the most immediate way by floor managers or park managers, by maintenance services, etc., to do the first action of social distancing in the existing spaces, which by and large mainly happens through taping. So I give you a few examples of how tape brings the first reorganization of architecture and help people to adapt their behavior, their social behavior, to the new reality. And very often, this is a matter of reducing the accessibility and the floor space of the public arena, the public sphere. So it's reductive, it is protective, it's trying to avoid certain behavior rather than instill or inspire. But it's a very clear indicator of how the scientific insights that I just mentioned can be interpreted in terms of space, how they can be translated. And besides taping, we also see how people organize their social behavior in terms of lining up and observing distance among each other. So this is a picture that was taken, I think, March 10 or so, when the awareness was not yet so strong, and people were eagerly trying to buy their decent stock of marijuana in the Netherlands. So you see here people lining up for buying before the shop was supposed to close to have enough of marijuana. And here you see already at a larger distance among the different people, people lining up in Arizona before the lockdown of many shopping malls, people buying arms. Also as a sign of different cultures and their first response to an emergency. And here you see another step, how people patiently observing social distance, trying to buy their basic livestock in a village in Africa. So you see the awareness of social distancing being translated in the social behavior of people as a factor to consider. And another interesting issue is how, and now I come back a little bit to the architectural world itself, how the new reality is being observed as an opportunity and as a reality that is not only bad. So more and more photographers started to go out, some with permission and some even without permission, to or they send their drones, photo cameras to shoot a new reality of architectural purity and clarity, so to speak, when once it was devoid of the hordes of tourists that normally would blur the picture. So a certain almost perverse happiness to see architecture re-emerging as it was intended by the original architects, and its beauty and clarity and rhythm, so to speak. So here are these examples of architecture without the social disturbance, so to speak, of too many people enjoying it. Times Square, people enjoying the flyovers in the city as the new skateboard routings. Another example of the architecture world responding to the new situation here, Archinect.com, the website from California with a global reach, has recently presented the virtual event guide covering all these different conferences and biennales and design weeks, translating their activities into digital platforms, and a very handy help to keep track of all these changes and still be in touch with the people you were supposedly to miss out on, no longer being able to attend all the openings. And then another interesting meme that I saw relating very strongly with the very medium that we are using tonight, where you see how people start to speculate on the implications, the cultural implications, and the transgression of cultural tropes, so to speak, once we start to get used to culture being produced online from remote locations, only temporarily being connected through the protocol of a internet session. So I'm moving more and more towards what architecture in this situation can do more than just enjoy the emptiness of the streets or enjoy the virtuality of alternative spaces. But is there something architecture can do directly in the physical space itself by contributing to the discourse of distance, relying on thousands of years of spatial intelligence and savviness in organizing our spaces? So the first level of this is a re-estimation, a new respect for engineering. And I saw this picture today on Twitter where the clash, or you could say the tension, between solutions that have a certain fancy element in it that belong to maybe a slightly frivolous world of design, and the claim engineers are making that they may be the ones to come up with more stable and decisive solutions, like an architecture that really deals with air quality, for instance, or that would return to daylight as the source of health. Very much in the same spirit and vein as the examples that I showed from Duiker and the Open Air School, or Henri Sauvage and his housing in Rue Vavin. And here is an immediate example of an architecture that, of course, cannot jump into the current crisis situation immediately, since this is about the very slow art of architecture, so it takes time, but immediately, at least in terms of theorizing how existing technologies can help creating a more healthy climate, and in particular battle the airborne spread of coronavirus by using UV light. So engineering has a very strong card. There are many more examples of engineers coming up with proposals, but as I said, it takes time to implement them. And here is another example of engineering, but this is software engineering from China. It's now heavily discussed as an approach in many Western parliaments as well, to use the power of smartphone apps to trace people back to their risk, having risk of being contagious, being in touch with infected people. Tracking of people's movement and tracking people's contact with risky other people, so to speak. So once again, it is still engineering. It is based on a very rigid and analytical approach of the problem, but it shows how engineering, as a matter of fact, is already in charge of many of the avenues of solving the problem or about to enter them. But on a more, on the softer side of design, let's say back to the more frivolous part, of course, there's also already an incredible dispatch of spatial intelligence to do very simple things with very immediate effects. So the umbrella that is no longer only protecting you from the rain above, but may also help you to protect you from the aerosol contagious saliva from people around you who may be infected, to school kids in China coming back to school after many months of closure with some results of their homework, with hats each are wearing with a kind of rotor around it, the rotor creating a 1.5 meter perimeter around them. So from the maker spirit of the Chinese youngsters to an immediate solution, helping them, especially at this young age, to keep a certain distance, because once they come too close, they will hit the rotor and they will be remembered by the sound of that, of the warnings of their peers. And more and more, I'm coming to examples where people show the inventivity and ingenuity to still observe the rules of the game of social distancing, and still continue with the messaging that they were strong with before. So trying to re-embed social life, personal life, and the current political discourse in the new spatial reality that is paramount in the age of social distancing. And from the very political one to the extremely personal one, one example of people who have to observe the distance between the young generation and the older ones, with all the risks that come with contact, and still be able, just by a very simple gesture, to send a message across the distance to be observed, and make a big impact to the personal happiness of people just by the inventivity of the individuals. And given those examples, I think it's time to consider some of the background thinking that is not only recent and something that is steered by the current situation, but it's actually part of the architectural discourse already for decades and even longer. I would like to ask your attention for this book, The Hidden Dimension by Edward Hall. It's a fantastic study how space actually is a psychological issue. It's not only medical or physical or architectural, but it's in the end something that we experience. That's the basic message. And it addresses the different levels of space, the spatial, the hidden dimension, the space you need around you, between intimate space, personal space, social space, and wider. And that for each of these different parameters around you, people have a different psychology. And as a matter of fact, what he's explaining is that each of these levels do have a clear indicator of how much space they need. So for intimate distance, it's actually haptic space. It's very, very near to each other. So it's only accepted from people you know very well or you're even in love with. Personal distance is good for friends and family, and it's a maximum to 4 feet. And now we are talking about 6 feet in the social distance discourse of today. And that's in terms of Edward Hall's thinking. That would be called social distance, 4 to 7 feet, close phase, and far phase, 7 to 12 feet, which is relevant for contact with acquaintances. And then you have public distance used for public speaking, which is beyond 12 feet. So it is interesting to consider the work of Edward Hall, because it may help us to see that when we discuss the need, but also the trouble of social distance, that actually we are talking about a certain interval in the range of different spaces we need around us, and in particular social distance. So it's an interesting coincidence that this is also called social distance by Edward Hall. And we have to consider reorganization of the social distance, which is in particular important in terms of people we are acquainted with. Closer than that may not be the problem. Further than that might also be not the problem, but especially people who would like to talk to in a certain formal way, acquaintance, on the level of being acquaintance, that's the level that we need to reorganize. And that's why I think the psychological level is so important. I came up with the what occurred to me, what struck me was a certain similarity of discourse with the discourse of the psychogeographic art, so to speak, from the situationist movement, the work of Guy Debord and his followers in the 50s and 60s, that actually took this psychological dimension completely as point of departure. What is interesting in the work of Debord is how we presented the city no longer as a material artifact or as a routing system helping you to move from A to B, nor as a political or social system, but as something that in the end very much relates to the way we behave and think in this world, and how we can navigate the world around us. So in a way, it is a navigational system full of psychological effects. And it's interesting to think back of this important cultural source once we reconsider the way we create distance today, and how this social distance, this level 3, in the words of Edward Hall, would actually become designed and reconceived and retypologized, and in particular being embraced by people who are trained to do so, architects, in the coming months and years, to fit the discourse that I mentioned coming from the scientists who are urging us to keep the social distance to a level that keeps the society going. So in a way, you could say science and art meet in the proposition of Debord and the psychogeographic movement. So as defined here, he defined psychogeography as the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of the individuals. So once we want to make these interesting counter proposals that I just presented a few of as something more structured, and more rigorously conceived, I think it's very interesting to keep in mind the emotional and behavioral aspect of the way we navigate the city. And especially when it comes to developing our own mental maps in walking around, I think we are only at the very first phase. Once we go through supermarkets or on the street or in the subway, trying to keep the distance, we are only at a very first stage of creating interesting detours, interesting journeys by going through the city. And I also would like to mention this book by Rebecca Solnit as an interesting expose about the psychological richness of the long walk, and how maybe at first sight, at first impression, the extended journey to get your groceries or to get you to meet your friends at a 1.5 meter situation in a park, that to get there may be conceived as something interesting in itself, as a journey that you can have memories from, as something that could be compared to something that architects already know for hundreds of years, which is the importance and beauty of the promenade architecturale. And I give you some other examples how with a very small intervention, by just using some language or marking a spot, architects and designers can support this richness of the psychological experience of the city, referring to certain moments in time, or intensifying the situation that you find yourself in, just by adding a little bit of value, but opening a window to get your mind in another universe. So the introduction of alternative media like music or choreography or dance could be a very interesting addition to make the urban experience in these harsh times more interesting and maybe even unforgettable in the end. Here another example how conferences no longer possible at the moment in most countries, because people are not supposed to sit next to each other, that by way of using infrared reception, you could have people spread over a larger amount of space and still be in contact with speakers who they may not even see, they may be somewhere else, but meanwhile still enjoying the richness of the spatial surrounding. And as a matter of fact, when I'm showing you those examples of tactical interventions, it's clear that physically speaking, materially speaking, financially speaking, you don't need much. It's more about the awareness and the perception artists, dancers, architects, designers may have to see a possibility to make a twist and to switch the mindset of the passers-by, users, people who gather. So I believe that these examples are indicators of what architecture can do in terms of presenting alternative scripts to use public space, in particular when it's so important to create a sense of distance. You don't need much, the effect can be big. And to finish, and that's the promise from the beginning of the speech, when I asked for the Catholic dimension of the audience, I would like to say a few words about a deeper layer of this attitude Of course, you can go back to the 60s and 50s and the playfulness of the situationist movement, but you can also go back 1,000 years to the Cistercian order or other monastic orders in Europe, when there was a certain keen interest in redesigning, you could say, reconceiving the value of scarcity. So when we are in a situation facing a spatial scarcity, and when we have to spend time to overcome that, we have to walk longer, we have to wait sometimes. These are almost could be considered as moments of scarcity of space and time. And this is, of course, at first sight, an hassle, inconvenience. But once you can see that as something that has a spiritual quality in itself, you can also see it as a starting point to re-enjoy and reconceive your surrounding and your city. And this is something that painters knew, and that social movements knew at certain points. It's also comparable to a tradition of spirituality, knowing that time need to be organized in opposites. And fasting, for instance, the return to sobriety after a period of wealth and even more than that, let's say abundance and even decadence, so to speak. That moment of scarcity is not just something like a reality check or something that is enforced by the rise of an epidemic, but actually can also be seen as a cultural turnaround that has a very long tradition and has been inspiring people and artists and writers and philosophers and even economists for centuries. So here, the reason why I thought, why not pay respect to the Catholic University of Leuven at the beginning. This was the Easter sermon as preached by Pope Francis recently, when the observation of social distance was already incorporated in the way they managed the St. Peter in Rome, relying on high-tech transmission of the message, the holy message, so to speak, but actually by doing so, creating again a very strong spatial moment in real time, real space. And to finish with architecture, this organizing, this staging, this choreographing of austerity in space and accepting the challenge of scarcity as something that can inspire. I also show some very seminal pictures of the mindset that is behind such a belief and hope. And architects not so long ago were themselves strong in advocating such a moment of fasting and reappreciation of the constraints around you, because it could strengthen your mind and make you more resilient and resourceful in finding solutions for yourself and for the other. Here, Le Corbusier and a cell in La Tourette. So to finish, I would like to read this quote by Marcus Aurelius. Our actions may be impeded, but there can be no impeding our intentions or dispositions, because we can accommodate and adapt. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And this is a cover of a book that presents this mindset in a very nice way. It starts as a detour, it starts as a hurdle, it starts as a blockade, it starts as a slowdown, it starts as a crisis, but it's not necessarily that way forever. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this enormous amount of wealth and of thinking around the distancing. Thierry, can you?
Yeah, I saw
light in your darkness there.
A question of someone asking how they have to clap their hands, or at least give some kind of token of approval, or I don't know, of respect or appreciation. I guess there is many food here to have a talk. Everyone can ask questions in the Q&A. Maybe someone, we can start with a question, I think, which strongly relates to the last few things that you have been saying, Ole. It's a question from Gunther Weemeyer. Do you give the floor to?
Yes, let me give the floor to Gunther. Gunther, can you speak yourself?
Sure. I think Ole just pointed to this at the very end, where he spoke about monastery traditions in a way. So basically, I'm looking the positive effects of distancing, like monastery traditions of being separated in solitude and being distanced from normal life. And I wonder what kind of new distance spaces could emerge as a new means to connect us to ourselves, to spiritual grounding, to mindfulness, to resilience, to nature flourishing. Because we are all in a collective trauma right now. So, and I think there's a huge opportunity to build and ideate spaces which basically focus on the positive effects of distancing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the speech was covering a couple of examples how how a situation that at first sight seems to be a matter of constraint and scarcity, how they can be reconceived into an alternative mode or even narrative. And I think that is the challenge today in our current predicament, also to digest the way new rules are inhibitive or are making us, let's say, unable to pursue the same lifestyle and to express or materialize the same ambitions maybe as before. So it's a kind of, as you say, trauma situation where you have to cope with this. Very often after an initial denial, where you maybe start thinking, well, let's do this for a couple of weeks before we go back to normal, and then weeks turn into months, and who knows, they turn into seasons and semesters and even years. According to the scientists, that may take a long time, for quite a few years, even within this epidemic situation. So you can imagine how this process of coping will mature and overcome the initial denial or waiting out modus, and start to see opportunity in it, creative beauty, so to speak. And I mentioned quite a few examples, but I'm very sure that it's only the beginning of this reconception.
I think we have here another question which perfectly connects to
Thanks
what
for the question, Gunther.
saying, which is one from Alexander Halabi.
Hello.
Hi, Alexander.
How are you, Lilette? First of all, basically, Ole, thank you for your lecture. And you answered my question through Gunther's question, actually. So the thing is that I'm thinking of the pandemic as a temporary situation, and you stated that it is a trauma, basically. So I think when traumas happen, we should respond to the traumas as they happen, not respond to the traumas as permanent situations, but as temporary situations. So why go through all the effort to adapt to designing distance for a long-term period of time rather than design distance for a short-term period of time whenever that is needed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this question maybe stems from the idea that architecture is a profession to create stable conditions, and that means to use construction to materialize those conditions for long term. And in many cases, in many situations, that's true. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, I think architecture is not by nature, and it's not the alpha and omega of architecture to end up with construction. It is, for me, the smart and beautiful organization of our spaces. So when there is a major spatial issue, like we are facing today, it would be extremely pitiful not to have architects engaging with it, because they are constantly engaging with spatial issues. So I'm hoping that the question I'm raising will be embraced by architects, not from their professionalism as designers of buildings, but as creators of spatial situations, which is part of their work, maybe even the core of their work. And like the examples I showed, there are examples of architects, but there are also examples of artists and singers and dancers. So in a way, the issue of the boundary of architecture and who is doing what is not my point. My point is that we need to rally all the spatial intelligence in society, and I'm hoping that this spatial intelligence among architects is still one of the most important factors of their profession.
Thank you.
So on the one hand, you could say maybe it's more permanent than we hope, the situation. I gave one scientific reason, because they expect it to last for quite a while. So we may have to observe the 1.5 meter or the 6 feet for quite a while. There are also people already anticipating, due to many factors, including the diminishing of our biodiversity, that we may we're heading for new pandemics in the future. Maybe there is a good chance we may be in a similar situation later. But obviously, in terms of a decade or a little bit more, we have the issue of the climate crisis and the need to make massive transformations of our built environment to be ready for that situation. And this can also be a situation in which we are forced to prepare for the long run, rather than sit it out, wait it out, and get back to normal once this pandemic is over.
Thank you.
I have here a question from a colleague of ours, Van Sterken. I don't know if he's still present. I think it's an interesting question because it somehow relates to architecture's history that you also have been using to develop your argument. Is Sven there?
Ole, thank you very much for this talk. I was quite looking forward to see what you would come up with, and I have in fact many more questions than this single one, but maybe my first remark was about the image that you showed of the cell by Le Corbusier in the Couvent de la Tourette, which is of course like the, let's say, emanation of the fascination by modernist architects for this restraint, this self-imposed restraint, which I think fascinates most of us. This becomes particularly clear if you look at the backgrounds of when you do these kind of Skype meetings. Either you see books, either you see empty walls. Anyway, I was wondering, isn't it precisely this let's say fascination or this almost imposed austerity that has put off so many people from modernist architecture? That this is precisely not what people expect from how their daily lives or daily environments should be managed or look like.
Yeah. Yeah, this question has many faces. I think in terms of the I didn't mention this as the kind of overarching conclusion,
Sure.
to go back to restraint or to go back to austerity or ascesis, right? So it was not my it's not my point to make a Christian argument. I only mentioned it as one of the sources from which you can take inspiration once you have to face a situation of scarcity. So when space becomes becomes scarcer, so to speak, when you have to observe distance, I think you can learn from the most playful and maybe also dissident thinkers who reject all kinds of constitutional thinking, actually want to transgress and play.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, which I mentioned with Guy Debord, but I also think you can be inspired by 1,000 years of tradition of monasticism, where scarcity is taken as a reason for life, right? So as you can appreciate life more when you have to go around things, literally. Right? Mm-hmm. So if you do not immediately get your satisfaction or reach your goal, so this could be an element in this second phase or next phase of coping with a trauma, when it's no longer about sitting out or getting grumpy about it, or hoping for a quick relief, but actually start seeing it as something that can become a constitutional element in redesigning culture. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think architecture has an amazing history, has an amazing legacy of works that actually transform scarcity into an incredible wealth, mm-hmm. A spiritual wealth. And it's not only a tiny space, of course. It's not only the spatial constraint in physical terms, but actually it is more like the payoff that by constraint you can open, almost like mental windows that you cannot if you're only constantly pursuing your satisfaction or your goal. You see what I mean? So that is a suggestion to find inspiration in very long traditions that may be more helpful than we think today.
Yeah, I totally agree. with you from the viewpoint, let's say, of the designer or the architectural community, but I'm not sure if this is what, let's say, society wants to hear after 7 or 8 weeks of confinement. That I'm not really sure.
No, but I think most architects also don't want to hear this. Actually,
Yeah.
I mentioned something like this in a few previous statements on social media, and I notice already a strong objection because it indicates a change of practice and a change of perception, and maybe also a change of roles. And this indication is already too much, right? But you're right. When it comes to clients or even the users, the general people, they may not yet be able to think in terms of spiritual elevation once they are losing their time, or when they cannot meet, or when they feel lonely at home. And so that's true. And I don't know if I can come up with a decisive argument to let them believe in this. But since we had what was it, 97% architects audience, I hope in this secret society we can pay respect to this opportunity.
Okay. Can I just connect with one more question that somehow ties into what you just said?
Shortly.
Sorry?
Short.
Yeah, sure. It will be short. Yeah. In Belgium, there's now a sort of committee composed of experts that is supposed to guide the transition to almost normal life, or at least pretending that we could somehow return to normal life. And I found it quite striking that it's populated mainly by people with an economical or political or medical backgrounds. And what would your suggestion be for the architectural community to somehow try to get into that cockpit? Because I think there is really an opportunity for us there to help shaping this future aspect of public space or space in general. So what could be like a way of trying to get a voice into that debate, because it feels like we're very absent at this moment.
Are you asking Thierry?
I was asking you. It's a sort of, I know there's no answer to the question, of course, but perhaps the situation in Holland is different or not.
Well, I'm living in China, so but I think it's quite similar in the Netherlands, and it might also be quite similar in China even, because the public respect for architecture to play a role in social modeling is not very strong. And even among architects for a long time, the economical defense is much stronger than the spiritual defense, so to speak. So architects are quite okay with the reduction of their intelligence to producing built environment, right? So to have architects being involved in alternative, for instance, in the way our public domain is being organized and enriched it has not a very strong tradition at the moment. So is there any debate in Belgium about the need for having more architects in this committee?
Not yet, and that's why I'm asking the question. I didn't see pop up any critical voices from the architectural community so far.
No. So that means that the medics are going to be replaced by the economists, and the creative sector stays aside. Yeah,
there was a reaction from the humanities. There was a petition signed by a lot of academics from the humanities, but there was, as far as I remember last week, there was no architects or let's say people from the spatial side, let's say, involved. So that's maybe something we should come up with soon. But thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Sven. Yeah, I would like to give the opportunity to Lilith students. They prepared 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
Ola, and they are of different kind. So in that sense, it might be interesting to see go into another direction, maybe.
Thank you for your lecture. We had more open questions. So the first one was that the framework of today's lecture was mediating tactics. And so what do you think are some key aspects for an architect to be a good mediator?
The context for this lecture was what exactly? Techniques?
Mediating tactics, that's the engagement that organized this lecture, which is the engagements around which the studios of our faculty are organized.
Yeah. Well, I tried to speak as tactically as I could, raising a lot of issues and showing lots of examples, which I think more have tactical value than immediate policy value. And by doing so, raising questions and enhance speculative capacity of architecture, hoping that this would fit Thierry's agenda. But maybe Thierry can also respond in the way because you develop a discourse in the long run, not just tonight, but over a couple of weeks. So
Yeah.
maybe you can explain.
I would like indeed to respond shortly. You asked a question about mediating tactics. And of course, you can put, it's 2 words, and it's dependent on where you put the first emphasis. And I think in this case, the first emphasis for me would be on mediation, because it's a relational term. And mediation is something that happens in between things. People, for example, also a person with a building and so forth. And so how these kind of interactions between things can be generative to create things. I also think that architecture is kind of, also has a technological aspect to it. And technology, how I see it, is a kind of mediating device, something which changes your relationship with something else. So it's about these, for me, there is this kind of emphasis on these relational issues in the broad term. And the problem with the term tactics is that it, maybe it puts right now some on the wrong track in the sense that it seems to be something very planned, very directional, and that doesn't have to be necessarily the case. I don't know if it's an answer to the question, but that's some additional clarification as far as I'm concerned. So if you ask architecture and mediation, I think architecture is a mediator by definition, in one way or another. Laura, you had a second question.
Yeah, so our second question for Ole Bouman was that as you've worked on published magazines and curated exhibitions, as well as done lectures and debates, which medium do you think is best to communicate and convey ideas?
There is no answer to that. There is no best medium. So in the spirit of your previous question about tactics, I think the tactical mindset means that you do not choose one medium. You choose impact, you choose effect, and you adapt methodology, medium, narrative even, to the impact you want to achieve. So that is I think that makes it impossible to prioritize a medium that works best. Everything, all the examples I actually mentioned are situational. I even mentioned the situationist movement. So for situationists, I think to prioritize a methodology is almost like a contradiction. And you, what would you like to choose a medium and say this is what I believe in, this is going to be my profession, and that's how I want to be seen as a professional? I'm asking something back.
I think it's hard to know, as we haven't experimented with any of those. I think it depends, yes, how much people you want to reach. In some way, for example, architecture is going to reach more people in the long run, but maybe here we want, depending if you want something fast or something, like, I guess it depends on the impact, as you said, and that will determine the medium you choose. I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Ole, are you still willing to take a question?
Yeah, we can take another one.
Martin de Mazeneer has one for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ole, for your most interesting contribution. And for sure, in the light of, again, our series of master students who want to make their final dissertation nowadays. And for the time being in the media, but you hear a lot of the questioning about densification. It's like, yeah, a direct implication of architecture and urban planning. And maybe this kind of new condition pushes us toward that other condition and bring in the imaginary parts of architecture. Indeed, again, in as I understood you're suggesting too, we are confined to our very limited direct environments, and being limited to that, nevertheless, our connection via our computer, but it's still a very square and flat thing. We really depending on our direct environment and the impulses we get from that. So the importance of space in a broader sense becomes every day more and more sensible, I think. So I just want to, yeah, bring up the like you say also the straightforward economic facet of architecture and urban planning that we always are pushed to densify our way of living. But should it be like that? Even if you see like the very small cell of Le Corbusier in La Tourette, you immediately see the color, the green color of the floor, and how the detailing is done. The only wall that opens onto the cell, it's detailed in a particular way. So all those things which I had the impression that last years or last decades went away a bit, or the attention shifted from it, with this kind of new conditions pushes it forward again. So this might our chance for it to claim it again, I think.
Mm-hmm. Good statement.
No, you said it, so I'm like.
But I left out of the equation one point that has been raised now in 2 or 3 questions, which is, you know, I can emphasize the role of architecture and art and dance and let's say creative thinking. I can emphasize the psychological dimension, but the whole story will be very tough to defend when I need to add a business case, right? So the way we organize our economy is also based on a spatial order. There's also a spatial contract of our economy, just like there's a spatial contract for our urban psychology and our experiences in public life. And if we are going to, and that's also I think important for Sven Sterken's question about this committee. Once you try to overcome the current situation from purely economical perspective, it will almost be inevitably something like going back to a tightening of the spatial contract, because if it's about earning money again and sustaining our current lifestyle and our economy, then 1.5 meter may simply just be too much distance. So we can, on the one hand, envision a world where 1.5 meter becomes something not just bad or negative or distant, so to speak, but as an inspiration to reconceive our spatial contract. But at the same time, we need to do the same for our economy, and that is much harder to do. So I think it will be incredibly difficult once we could relax a little bit our, let's say, our strictest observations, strictest rules at the moment. Once we could relax them to not to submit or to succumb to an economical thinking that deprives us from any cultural benefit that we may find when our coping mechanism of today is successful. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So when economy will be the ruling factor in the post pandemic situation, it's almost inevitable that we just go back to business as usual.
Yeah, I hope not, because architecture seems to be about a lot of assets and not so much about like how do we live our lives in the world around us. So maybe this pandemic brings things together again, I hope. And for sure, it's important, the economical model, but it's not the only model. And the question is that we can live with architecture as assets only, and the whole human part almost being taken away from it. Thank you.
Maybe it's time to stop. I would like to do that with one question, which was still pending, but I think it would be nice to leave it open, like unanswered. The question is, space has been scarce even for the dead, Italy, Ecuador, etc. How do we plan for a dignity of death? Ole, I want to thank you very much for your precious time that you have been willing to share with us, and for all your wisdom. Thank you.
Great pleasure.